Good morning to everyone in Europe and in Africa. A good afternoon to everyone in Asia. And for those few brave souls out there who are logging in from the Americas, a good night to you. And dear participants, welcome to the 14th Sea Change webinar, the fourth one in the 2013 series, collaboratively being developed between Sea Change Community of Practice and Mr. Glenn O'Neill of ALRE. And having said that, the title for today is Presenting Evaluation Findings, and I seem to lose my presentation. Presenting Evaluation Findings and Evidence-Based Organizational Learning. No specific climate focus in today's webinar, though some examples might come from projects in related fields like disaster risk management and national resource management. But there was quite the interest for this topic, with over 200 people registering, and also a lot of members asked for a webinar specifically looking at how to present evaluation findings and to talk a little bit about evidence-based organizational learning. And I knew Glenn O'Neill from the EES, the European Evaluation Society conference in Helsinki last October, and I saw him doing a presentation there, and I thought I have to enthuse him to do the presentation for us here today, and fortunately he was willing to do so. My name is Dennis Boers, I'm the Sea Change team leader, and I will introduce Mr. Glenn O'Neill to you in a moment. We currently have 26 attendees, but with over 200 people registering, I'm expecting that some more people will be logging in pretty soon. The recording of this webinar and also all the documents that are being discussed will be made available on this page. And after this webinar, when the recording has been put online, you will also all receive an email to inform you about that. Some of you might know Sea Change already, and before I start introducing Mr. Glenn O'Neill, a little bit about Sea Change. We are a community of practice with currently over 600 members, and we look at the monitoring and evaluation of climate change interventions. And we try to develop a culture of high quality, rigorous M&E frameworks, approaches and methodologies for responses and interventions to climate change and related practices in Asia and beyond. And webinars are one way in which we do so. Another way is also to send out our weekly newsletter. We maintain a resource library. We support our members in speaking engagement at conferences and also in publishing their work. So if you would be interested, just have a look at www.seachangecop.org. And having said that, let me now introduce Glenn O'Neill. Glenn started his career working for government and NGOs in Australia, and after completing his Masters in Communications Management, he went on to become an expert in evaluation methods and has led evaluation, research and communication projects for international organizations and corporations. It was in 2007 that he founded his own company called ALRE, and it is a consulting agency that supports organizations in analyzing and assessing activities in communications, training, events and development. And Glenn is currently completing a PhD in Research and Evaluation Methodology at the Methodology Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he teaches research and communications courses at the International University in Geneva. And he also co-authors the Intelligent Measurement blog and the Geneva Communicators Network. And later on, when you can download this presentation as a PDF file, then you will be able to click on these pictures here. You will go to the blogs that he works on. And yesterday there was an interesting item on the Intelligent Measurement blog that looked at evaluation of NGO advocacy work, and I think that's also a quite interesting topic. So keep an eye on intelligent measurement and have a look at the other sites that I'm putting out here. As said, this presentation will be put online on our platform, and together with the recording of the webinar, so everything will later on be accessible. My name is Dennis Boers. I'm the Sea Change team leader, and my job is managing the Sea Change community of practice and the online knowledge platform on the M&E of climate change intervention. And before we start with the webinar, let me take a moment for a little bit of logistics information. The webinar will take about 40 to 45 minutes, after which there will be time for questions and answers. Right now I'm doing the 5-minute introduction and a little bit of webinar logistics, and in a moment Mr. Glenn O'Neill will start presenting for 20 minutes on how to present your evaluation findings for different audiences, and after that he will focus on how to become an evidence-based learning organization with some tips towards knowledge management. After that there is 20 to 30 minutes to have a discussion on these topics. And you can ask your questions, and Mr. Glenn O'Neill and also myself will try to answer them. Any questions that would not have been answered in these 20 to 30 minutes will be answered offline and published also on our website. Now normally we are able to answer all the questions in the time that we have for the Q&A. And yes, as said, the link provided here is also where the webinar recording will be put online. Let me show you how you can ask questions at the end of this webinar. You can type them in the question field in the software, and you can already do that during the webinar, so you don't need to wait till the end. If you have a question about a certain slide, you can already type it while Glenn is still presenting. And at the end of, during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, we will read out your questions towards Glenn. We don't make use of the hand-raising tool that is sometimes used because it takes a little bit too much bandwidth, and we want to accommodate people who also have a low internet bandwidth. And with this introduction, I now should stop talking, and I'm going to hand over the microphone to Mr. Glenn O'Neill.
Thank you, Dennis.
And I'm also going to give you the screen in a second, and there we go.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I hope
yes,
it's very. You see it? Great. Yeah. Thanks, Dennis. So thanks again, Dennis, for that introduction. I'm very happy to be with you all today to talk about evaluation communications, both subjects which I'm very much interested in and involved in my professional work, as Dennis so well introduced me. So perhaps to kick off right into the subject, as Dennis said, my background is really that of a communicator working in evaluation. So whenever I'm doing evaluation, and I've been involved in, I think, some 40 evaluations in the past years in over 50 different countries, I'm always thinking of the communication aspects. And here on the screen you can see a quote from George Bernard Shaw, who was an Irish playwright, who said, as you can see, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Sorry about that. If you saw a window on the color scheme. So what I wanted to say was, what does that mean? Well, actually, if you think about this quote, it basically means, well, you know, most people think in evaluation, for example, we put out our report, it's communicated, you know, it's already done. So people believe they are communicating, but, you know, perhaps they are in some ways, but in other ways they are not. So it's not so simple as we think, as Mr. Shaw wrote. Now, from that point, I wanted to just speak a little bit about what we call communication theory. And as we say here, as a quote, I'm misquoting someone that says, "There's nothing so practical as a good theory." Now, communication theory, how does it work? Basically, 100 years ago, the theory was, it was very simple. The organization prepares the message sends to the public, and everyone's persuaded and does what the organization wants them to do. This is the so-called silver bullet theory. And it's the same way. You put out your evaluation report, the people read it, they are informed, and they act. But in fact, you know, over time what we found is that, well, actually the public is not really homogeneous. There are actually many different groups, some receptive and some not so receptive. And also very interesting for what we're talking about today is in fact, it's not so much the content of the communications, of the message, of your evaluation report, but it's the way that it's presented. It's the way that you present your evaluation findings, for example, that can count up to 70%, I repeat, 70% of what is retained or understood. I mean, that's quite incredible if you think about it, but studies show that in communications. That's why if you see politicians, for example, they pay so much attention as to how they present their message, how, in what format, is it visual in terms of what channels do they send the message to us, the public. At the same time, it got sort of more complicated in that they found that actually, publics wanted to really be able to communicate back to the organizations, feedback. So communications was never one way. Actually, publics wanted a dialogue with organizations, companies. I say organizations, it could be companies, governments, etc. And also, even more so, that there was more organizations actually communicating on this issue. So you, as your organization, did not dominate the message. So this also had to be taken into account. In evaluation, for example, you're communicating on that point, but there's many others communicating on it. So your message will not always get through 100%. And what you also had, and that's that splash put up now, was the whole question of noise. Basically, people getting distracted, people paying attention to other things in all different situations means that they may not understand the message. Imagine you're delivering your evaluation presentation, but they're already thinking about other points that they've heard, so your message is perhaps distorted. And this is the expression that people say in English, you took it completely the wrong way in the way I said it, So it's the same sort of theory. At the same time, what was found was actually the more interactive the communication process, the more persuasive the communication became, and studies show that. What does that mean for evaluation? It means that the report sent to people is not going to really perhaps be understood, read, and persuasive. What's going to be more persuasive is the discussion, is the workshop, is the visuals. These are the things that are going to be more convincing of people and aiding understanding. And when we talk today, I mean, for example, the notion of using visuals, it's a technical point in passing a message, but studies show that visuals, graphs, pictures, images aid understanding in the same way that the method you use in terms of interaction, for example, discussions with people, aid understanding than a simple one-way communication such as sending out a report. Now, if we jump from there, we can look and see, well, okay, communication, and this is a sort of a standard way of looking at communication. I'm interested to communicate, and when we want to communicate something, and thinking about evaluation, we can put it in this way: what, how, to whom, with which effect. So let's just look at that in the framework of evaluation. So we say, okay, evaluation, what is it about evaluation we want to communicate? And it's not so simple. People think of the report, but is it so simple? Well, we can say, let's look at that again. We can also communicate on the process itself. I was recently involved in an evaluation where the stakeholders, it was very sensitive, and the stakeholders were very keen to see our progress. So we basically, during the evaluation, we set up a blog where we would blog about the different field work and the meetings we were having, giving some sort of snapshots about how the evaluation was going ahead. So the process itself, communicating the process itself can be very important. At the same time, studies show that, a participative evaluation where you're involving people in the beginning, meeting with them, communicating, this is what we're doing, this is what we're going to do. When you release your findings, they'll be much better accepted if you involve the stakeholders and the people on whom the evaluation will have an impact. So, process is important. Findings, you can communicate your findings of evaluation, your conclusions, your recommendations. it's sort of interesting because when you talk to people, often what they read the executive summary of your evaluation report, but often they skip the findings and they go straight to conclusions and recommendations, which actually took me some time to realize, and that's interesting. So you have to think about how your conclusions written and communicated. And in terms of communication, you know, your conclusions and recommendations, often people will take them out of a written report. So they need to be, in a way, standalone, what I would say. So having some sort of summary in terms of a tool, this can be quite interesting. How? And I put here, you know, think beyond the report. You know, the report is not an interactive tool. Other methods exist to communicate better your evaluation findings, process, etc. And we're going to look at some of these tools in a second. It also depends on how interactive you want to be. If you don't really have the capacity to interact with people, then you're going to have to rely on rather static methods to communicate. Bearing in mind, the more interactive, the more persuasive, the more impact you'll have. But of course, you have to balance that with the resources you have available. Now, to whom? Staff, supporters, donors, affected populations. All these are important stakeholders to whom you can communicate. But very much, and what we seem to you know, often forget in evaluation is that communication and messages means that messages have to be adapted to different target audiences. So you might have different tools to reach different target audiences. For example, you might have a sort of feedback workshop to affected populations, which will have a different content than the report you'll send to donors. You might have a summary you'll send around to staff. You might have a webinar that you organize for supporters. So the tool is linked, of course, to the target audience. And finally, you know, with which effect? You know, what are you trying to get out? What is the result that you want out of your communication? You have to think about that in advance. You know, I put it here basically: inform, influence, or action, for example. Do you want it that people are better informed? Do you want it to influence the way people think about certain issues? Do you want it that it provokes change in the way they work? For example, that the recommendations are written in a way so they do provoke change in the organizations. There can also be many non-tangible effects, such as, you know, producing a better environment for evaluation, producing a more open communication, and we'll look at some of those points. But it does help if you think of these points in advance. Now, just to look in the next couple of minutes at some of the sort of, let's say some of the sort of tools that you can use. First, some sort of very static tools. This one taken from the International Labour Organization. You know, evaluation summary sheets, often forgotten about, but it can be a very useful summary as a tool to present evaluation findings that can be quickly read. You know, 1 or 2 pages. It can be an extracted executive summary, but it has to be standalone. You know, people have to be able to read this and not have to read the whole 50-page evaluation report. Also, depending on how your evaluation is structured, a sort of findings table. As you can see here, this is taken from a real-life example of an evaluation I did for OCHA, the UN Humanitarian Coordination Agency, where we can see here we listed our outputs, outcomes, and impact, and we try to have a sort of rating with the outcome listed, so people at a glance could see our evaluation on effectiveness in one quick glance. Scorecards taken from the private sector can be quite interesting also, depending on the data you have. Here we're looking at an evaluation of an event, a conference over time called LIFT. A technology conference takes place in Geneva every year. So here we can see how we could present this in this sort of format. Once again, it depends on the data you have. And very visual option, a sort of a photo story. And here we have an example taken from Mercy Corps Inside Share. And you can see the links to look at more of this. So the whole, you tell the story in a sort of what they call a photo story. So it can also be very interesting for certain target audiences. Once again, these sort of tools are very static tools. So they're just basically playing with the written content that you have, but it's more attractive ways. And of course you have charts and tables, graphs that I won't go into, but if you can look into some of the links that Dennis provided you with in terms of tips of using charts and diagrams, that also is of course advisable. More interactive ways to present evaluation findings. Blogs. As I mentioned previously, blogs can be quite interesting, and here's an example from the climate evaluation website. Basic blogging about evaluation findings can be a good way to disseminate information. Also blogs, as I gave the example before, can be a good way to disseminate and communicate on the evaluation findings. But I think you have to be realistic about blogs. Being a blogger myself for 6-7 years, it's not that you're going to get very much interactive comments and feedback on the blogs. You have to really think of it more as a way of disseminating findings. In the same way that other social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, they're also very good as a promotional tools to communicate your findings. But don't think of Facebook and LinkedIn so much, unless you have a good discussion going, for example, in a LinkedIn group. They're not so much an interactive tool. More interactive tools are, for example, webinars like what we're doing today, and other interpersonal small group techniques, briefings, presentations, workshops. They can be very time consuming, but can be very, very useful and targeted if you do for evaluation findings. Interactive web pages. And you'll see the link to this one after. This is an example, some of you may recognize the map. It's Afghanistan, where you can put your mouse over and see sort of progress towards achieving targets. Quite an interesting tool. And organizations are using this increasingly to give a snapshot or an overview of their evaluation findings and progress. Multimedia video report. This is one I did myself for an evaluation. You can see in the corner in the bottom for ACRA, Climate Change Initiative in Africa, where we produced a 9-minute video basically presenting the evaluation findings. 9 minutes is perhaps a bit long, I admit. We tried to squeeze in a lot of the evaluation findings in this sort of multimedia report, which is a video incorporating animation, interviews, photos from the field, etc. A very useful tool, and can be filmed and put up very inexpensive. We filmed all the films in this during our field visits using our telephones. But it's good enough quality to publish on the internet. If you can do it under 5 minutes, all the better for such a report. And when I look at the viewing statistics, I think last time I looked it was like 300-400 people had viewed the video. I can't guarantee that 400 people read our evaluation report, so it can be very useful in terms of presenting evaluation findings in particular. And of course the webinar. Here we have a nice screenshot, exactly as the sort of webinar we do now. Also can be used very much in presenting evaluation findings, also as a way of collecting data during the process of an evaluation. So webinars can be also very useful tools, as I mentioned, particularly when you work in global audiences. It can be very useful. Now, these are some of sort of the more interactive tools. Of course, as I mentioned, you have the sort of like other interactive tools, the more interpersonal tools that I won't describe, that are also very useful, workshops, meetings, etc., to present and communicate evaluation findings. So there's many different ways of presenting evaluation findings in the process of evaluation, and we look forward to your questions on this. And my experience has been that some of these tools can really basically get out your message to a broader audience and basically make the whole evaluation process and discussion and findings more interactive. And of course, organizations can have more formal ways to integrate the use of evaluation findings, such as follow-up mechanisms on recommendations. And of course these sort of mechanisms are useful and important, but also the more softer ways in terms of communicating messages can be important to get out to a broader audience than those really responsible for following up recommendations in an organization. Now, let's turn now a little to talk about, what makes an evaluation linking to a learning friendly, and what makes a learning friendly environment in organizations, which is linked to what we've just been speaking about. Now, if you look at the chart here, for an evaluation, for people to learn from an evaluation, I was thinking about this, and I came up also looking at studies that have been made, basically 5 points that for an evaluation in itself has to be, learning friendly, or else people cannot necessarily learn from an evaluation. The first thing is it has to be relevant, of course, so the people have to see this relevant to their area of interest, or they're not going to necessarily learn from it. I think it has to be operational. Operational meaning that it's, it's able in the way it's structured. If you think about the findings and the recommendations, that people have to be able to see their work in there. So, people, and all studies show that, the more precise the recommendations, for example, the more operational, and more people will be able to pick that up and run with it. Accessible, linked to communications. It has to be accessible to publics. So the report has to be readable. It has to be, if possible, visual, like what we saw some of the examples that we gave you. So it has to be accessible, not written in a language, or if written in a scientific language, there has to be key messages extracted from that and put in other formats to reach people. Timely, of course. How many evaluations have we been involved in where the report took 6 months to write, and when the report's delivered, everyone's moved on. So it has to be timely for people to learn about it. And lastly, participatory, in that people have to, the more, as I mentioned in the very beginning, the more participatory the evaluation, the more people will learn from it. So the more you involve people in the evaluation, potential audiences, people who are going to use it from the very go, looking at the terms of reference, involved in the discussions, and you feed back into those people over the evaluation process, the more they're going to take it on board for learning. The worst type of evaluation that I've experienced is where the evaluators come, they meet with people, they disappear for 3-4 months, and boom, the report lands on your desk, and you think, well, hang on, that doesn't really make any sense, and there's some fundamental, misunderstandings here. That's really the worst case scenario. So learning friendly in evaluation, how we can make evaluations more learning friendly. At the same time, the organization, this, I think it's hexagon, has to be more learning friendly. The organization has to be more learning friendly. Now, of course, you're working in an organization. There's only so much you can do to change the evaluation. But let's look at some of these points. As individuals, we can do something. Firstly, organizations have to create opportunities to learn. What does this mean? It means that, managers have to make time for it, to make time for people, even formally, feedback sessions, a general participatory approach, or informally, opportunities have to be there to learn. For example, a general spirit that learning is acceptable and it's culturally acceptable, that we will take criticism and discussion in our organization. So managers can do a lot to hope that. Motivation, motive. I mean, learning has to be valued and not frowned upon or looked down on. Motivation can be very tangible things like, there's training budget to be able to learn more, to be able to participate more. It can also be more non-tangible, the sort of open environment to learn. So organizations can do that. I think the notion of manage, that, that in a way organizations have to manage the way that learning's done. So to make, as we say, resources available, to make the staff have time to do that. And resources, of course, nevertheless, organizations need a budget for learning. If you look at the evaluation, in evaluation rarely are the after actions budgeted for. For example, the need to follow up on action, the need to communicate, to hold workshops, run webinars, rarely are they actually budgeted for that are going to facilitate the learning. So that has to be thought about. And lastly, communication. For organizations to be learning friendly, It's not only vertical communication, the supervisors communicating to the staff and vice versa. You know, the best sort of working learning that happens is across silos in organizations, that across teams, across colleagues are communicating. So people learn from studies done in other areas that are not particular, like the people working on program X learn from studies done on program Y and take lessons learned. That we can learn from clearly. Now, coming back to evaluation, let's think about it. Well, what can we actually learn from evaluation? And when I thought about this, I thought of these sort of 5 points, like, you know, if you're sitting in an organization, you're a consultant, you're a stakeholder, what can you learn from evaluation? I think there's a couple of points here. First, to, you know, improve this whole notion, which is very important, about how, you know, programs can be improved, how they can be better managed, you know, partnering strategies. You know, we can understand, you know, what worked, what didn't work, you know, what is the way forward. So that's a key point of what can be learned from evaluation. Also, what we can learn is that evaluation is often a participatory approach, so we can learn about the participation process. It can help us know how to work. Understanding, you know, many evaluations also bring greater insights and understanding into our own projects and programs and those of others. So that can be very useful. I mean, a lot of evaluations I've been involved in really bring insights into people, you know, that are managing the programs. You're bringing often the external insights inside the organizations, and that can be very useful to learn from. At the same time, we can learn about failure and success. These are very subjective and contextual words, but at the minimum, we can learn how people are measuring us, in our own organization, in other organizations, how we are being judged on, if you like, which can always be, of course, very interesting. And lastly, skills. You know, by actively participating in evaluation, we can learn. By observing and learning, participating, we can learn research, communication, assessment, interpersonal skills from evaluation. And I've seen over time in communication, when I've done evaluation with communicators, the communicators, they learn a lot about evaluation that is useful for them in their current work and future opportunities. Now, to summarize all this, when I thought about it, connecting learning with evaluation, firstly, you know, I think learning, it doesn't only come from communication aspects of evaluation, but obviously learning comes from the doing, you know, the doing, the evaluation being involved. It comes from observing, and it comes from listening. Observing and listening, also communication aspects. Secondly, evaluation can be, you know, learning can be informal or it can be formal, in a way that, you know, we can learn from evaluation in a formal and a planned setting, like a workshop, a webinar. We can learn from that. At the same time, we can learn from evaluation from a spontaneous, informal session, and perhaps, you know, some of the most valuable learning comes from that sort of informal, spontaneous opportunity. Like, for example, I've been involved in evaluations where someone has stopped me and said, oh, you know, I just happened to come across that document that you put together. I'm not working in that area, but it really inspired me to think about another way of doing our work, or to think about that evaluation that we're going to do. So, you know, we shouldn't only look at the formal planned way. And it's very interesting when I've done, as I said, I've done many evaluations, and it's sort of interesting because some of those evaluations that you think will have the most impact have the least impact. And some of the evaluations that you think will have the most impact have the least impact. It's very interesting as often you can't predict. Like, they might have formal structures to actually look at how they're going to use evaluation that don't really work. And sometimes it's the more informal ways that actually work better. We can chat about that if you're interested. And lastly, I think, you know, if I think about it, when I think about evaluation, you know, it's really, in a way, it's more convincing. If you like, it's more persuasive, which means it's going to bring about greater change when, firstly, coming back to what George Bernard Shaw said, when it's communicated, when we actually make an attempt to communicate beyond the simple written report. It's more convincing. Evaluation is more convincing. The findings and all the process when it's interactive, when it's participatory, when people can participate and have a dialogue around it. Because they will come out of that knowing more and more knowledgeable about your messages and about the findings, the process, etc. And lastly, it's more targeted when we're thinking about the actual messages of the evaluation. It will be more convincing when it's more targeted to given audiences and publics. So on this point, I'll hand back to Denny. Dennis, maybe I give you back the screen, and I guess we're right now ready to open up for questions.
Thank you for this presentation. Very interesting. I really liked it. I really liked the examples as well that were put forward. And by now you should all see my screen. And the question is, are there any questions? And
I do see.
Let me see. There we go. And I have a first question. And that question is from Daniel Delati. And the question is, would you have examples of presenting findings of participatory evaluations? And I know that the multimedia video report could be one of them, but do you have more examples of that?
That's a good point. I think if I understood the question right, yes, I think the whole point of presenting a participatory evaluation is a good point. I think how you can present it, I'm thinking of the examples I've seen, and maybe we can put some up later. I think where in the evaluation presentation, if you think of a simple like PowerPoint presentation, a good participatory presentation doesn't just focus on the text that you, the evaluator, has written, but it focuses also on quotes, images, maybe short videos of the actual affected populations and the people interviewed. And I've seen quite some good examples in sort of like real-time evaluations done in sort of Haiti in emergency situations. And maybe we can put some examples like that up, Dennis, on the webpage. But yeah, basically, where you show, the good thing in participatory evaluation is you've got to show in your presentation, for example, a PowerPoint, you've got to show the participants basically and give their point of view over your interpretation. I think that's a valid point.
Mm-hmm. And how would you get them involved? How would you get them invested in your evaluation communication?
I think that's a good point. I mean, there's different ways of doing it. I think one is that you're basically using what the participants have said to communicate messages on the evaluation. So you're sort of a relay for them. Mm-hmm. Also, what you can work on also is trying to have the participants themselves be a relay for you. In therefore, for example, what we've done, having participants participate in your webinar when you're discussing evaluation findings. So it's just not you, the evaluator, or the organization, but you have some, people from the field and the ground participating, for example.
And the first point was how to communicate in participatory evaluations. The second one was how to get them involved. And the third one would be how to communicate findings to them, because quite often they don't have the access to technology that we're showing here.
Yeah, I think that's really a challenge. What I've seen is, of course, if you think about affected populations that are, being impacted by programs in all different areas, I think the organizations have to take the time to go and talk and discuss with them once the evaluation findings have been made, so that, there's some efforts to feed back in. And you do have organizations I've seen do that. I think not as much as it should be, because it takes time and effort. But often I've gone to speak to populations and affected populations, and the main complaint you hear is, people always come and talk to us, but we never hear about, the results. We're interested to learn what people experience in other areas, but, people come and ask us questions all the time, but no one ever comes and, tells us what the findings are. And I've had that experience in many situations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And another interesting question from Kim San is, how do you communicate best to persuade policy change?
That's a very good point.
Communicate towards politicians.
Yeah, I think politicians, it's really, you have to look at sort of like, as Dennis said earlier, advocacy. You have to look at advocacy actions where you can use your evaluation findings to influence change. So you have to think about, how can I best present these messages? Because evaluation can be persuasive. Your evaluation findings can be very persuasive to bring about change. So that means politicians, you need opportunities to reach them. And that's not so easy. Often it can be, what I've seen in advocacy campaigns, you're influencing people around the politicians, so you're influencing their policy makers. Or you're trying to think of creative ways to get the message in the front of politicians. I mean, I remember an example where a UK charity wanted to communicate their research, not evaluation findings, but also research findings on a certain context that was undercovered in the UK market. So they organised like photo exhibitions presenting their research findings, and actually the Prime Minister spent 45 minutes visiting the exhibition. So in certain contexts like that, you can sort of make a change, but I think also you've got to think of different advocacy ways of reaching those politicians.
Yeah.
If you really, but I think the politicians, their time is very precious. Hard to get, so you have to think of ways to reach the policymakers, as the politicians are often, they're relying on their policymakers, and they're more accessible. So summarize information, also information that directly, talking to policymakers, as I've done in a lot of evaluations, they're always after summaries that really tell them, this is what we recommend for you to do. They're interested in targeted information related to the current policy. They're not interested in broad statements. They're interested in targeted information.
Yeah. In the next question, we're going back to the field level, and the question here is from Tsitsi Maradze, and I think he is actually logging in from Harare, because I got an email before from him. And the question is, have you ever used most significant change technique and tools in your work? And how would you get the best value using it in the field, given it is a lot about communication, it is about storytelling? How do you get the most out of it without getting caught in all kinds of technicalities of making use of it?
Yes, I'm familiar with the technique. I've never used it in its full extent. I mean, I've often been inspired by the basic notion of the most significant change methodology, which basically, to summarize it, and maybe to summarize it, I'm very summarizing it, is to ask, basically affected populations, what was the most significant change of this result? What was the impact for you, target audience, public? So I think it's a very useful methodology. I think if you want to do it, you have to do it properly. At the same time, you can pull out certain principles and apply it to many evaluation scenarios. So I think once again, it's really making sure when you communicate your evaluation findings that you do give that point of view of the people that were supposed to be impacted by the program or project that you're looking at.
Another point is how to convince, and that's Channing, how to convince your project staff that M&E is important.
Oh,
that's another type of communicating within your own organization, the importance of M&E.
Yes, I mean, that's a very good point. I think it's a very difficult one and a challenging one. I think, the best way is it's easier said than done, by getting, staff involved and getting them to help put together, what is it we're going to evaluate and what is it we're going to look at. Bearing in mind that evaluation often brings in very much sensitivities amongst staff because they feel they are being personally evaluated. So it's not an easy task, and particularly when donors, sponsors are the ones often asking for evaluation. I think it's quite interesting that it's often not the staff themselves. They feel they have a good grasp of the project, but then again, I think staff that are more open are more willing to look at the positive side of evaluation and not look at it as a personal assessment of themselves. And I think that's some difficult challenges there.
Yeah, yeah. In what way do you think evaluation has become an end in itself, opposed to a means?
Yes. No, I think in some certain senses it has. That the evaluation is a sort of a tick box, like we need to complete this evaluation, the donor has provided the budget, we need an external evaluation, so we have to do it. And that's really a shame, because, you know, so much the evaluation information collection data can be so useful for the programs. But you do see quite cases where the organizations and the individuals really just see it as, yes, exactly, they don't really use the information found and the data. So that's also very challenging.
Do you think that overall, looking at the past decade, evaluation has contributed to effectiveness, or do you think it became more and more a box that needs to be ticked?
I think personally it has. I mean, I do a lot of work in evaluating information, communication, advocacy programs, and in this area it certainly has, because the organizations have just started to do it. I can't speak more about other areas such as health, development, where evaluation has been going on for some time, but I really think it has. I mean, certainly in the if you look at evaluation of programs and projects, what it has helped is to make people running projects and programs, they have to now think more like when I was a humanitarian field worker 15 years ago. People have to think now more about, well, why are we doing this project? What are we trying to achieve? What are our outcomes, and how can we measure that? Of course, people can say that takes away a certain creativity and flexibility, but I tend to think more, it's good that people have to think more about that. What are they really trying to achieve?
Another question from Albert Salamanca. How do you best communicate negative findings?
Oh, yes. This is a good point, because I think I've been involved in quite a few evaluations where people are quite happy to communicate the positive findings, but they don't necessarily want to communicate the negative findings, and that is quite difficult. But I think where an organization is mature enough, they will communicate openly and transparently the evaluation findings. And if you look at many of the UN agencies, they have a policy to publish all their evaluation reports. So I think it's true. I think there's a relationship that you see where people will be more proactive communicating their findings when it's positive news. Where it's less positive news, they're going to be less active. And I think that's a shame, but that's, I think, more or less human nature.
Yeah. Another question from Ana Giusdado is, how can you assess beforehand the learning friendliness of an organization? And here we go to the second part, the learning friendly evaluation and learning friendly organization. How would you assess this in advance to know how you are going to make your organization? I mean, to know how to approach your organization, you need to know what its learning friendliness is at the moment to improve it.
Yes, I think, you know, you can make, if you're working with an organization, if you're inside the organization, I think you know, you can look at these different factors, resources, communication opportunities, and you will know yourself without having to make a large, you know, assessment. You will know that how learning friendly your organization is working within it. I think as an outsider, it's something you pick up intuitively when you work with organizations and you see how they function. I don't think you can make a formal assessment, of course, looking at different criteria, but my experience has been is that you pick up quite quickly how open an organization is to learning or not.
Yeah, yeah. Another question I got from Mazar Abbas is, you gave this figure that we now see on the screen. How does it relate to the 5 disciplines of Peter Senge towards learning organizations? And he talks about 5 disciplines being systems thinking, personal mastery, team learning, mental models, and shared vision building. And those disciplines are really more individual disciplines that you need within the organization to have a learning organization. And I think yours are more characteristics of a learning friendly organization. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think so. I think, yeah, exactly. These are more cross-cutting, sort of like what I would call more so criteria than Senge's model, which listening to them also, yes, seem to be more, I would say, sort of institutionalized aspects, structural aspects in some regards, not all. So, yeah, I would put it in that way. I think they're complementary.
Yeah. Is there any one methodology that raises more communication and learning challenges than others? One specific evaluation, M&E methodology that makes communication and learning more challenging? And that's a question from Robin Beecroft.
That's a good question. It's interesting. There's a lot of evaluations I undertake myself, a mixed method. So you're looking at quantitative and qualitative data. Mm-hmm. I think some of themselves, like obviously statistics lends itself to visuals and charts. At the same time, more qualitative methodology lends itself to storytelling and explaining the context better. But it's a good point. I'm thinking of other evaluation methodologies. Even your randomized controlled trial. I don't claim to have experience in that area, but if you think about it, it's very black and white often. So it's easy to communicate from a communication point of view. Yes, it worked. No, it didn't. Or we don't know. We can't tell. I think there's different aspects, but it's a good question. Some methods lend themselves to different ways of communication, and others lend themselves to other ways of being communicated. I would put it like that, as I gave the examples about qualitative lends itself to more storytelling strategies, as statistics lends itself more to graphs and charts and visuals.
Yes, and in that sense it will also depend very much on the type of stakeholder you're targeting with your communication. And maybe if you have a mixed approach in your M&E, then you might use more qualitative findings when you're looking at communicating with your beneficiaries, when you look at awareness raising, when you look at advocacy. And you will use more hard data, quantitative data, if you're communicating towards your donor, for example, who wants to see something on a scale from 0 to 100.
Exactly, and I think that's a good point. And even when you present, what I've found is 35% of the public were using this aspect of the program. The next question people will ask always in a presentation will be, well, why is that? So it needs a qualitative backup, even in the way it's presented. So the statistics, need some sort of interpretation, and that's often why evaluators use a combination of qualitative and quantitative. Because, I just did a study where we found, usage rates of different standards or guidelines, and one was very high and one was very low, and so people are asking. They want the evaluators to be able to explain, well, why was that very low? And often the evaluators will have a sense, because often they've done, qualitative work to understand why, and to be able to offer some explanations.
Yeah. And another question from Vishuli, which links a little bit to the first question of Kim San with respect to communicating to enthuse policy change. Now the question is how to enthuse government officials to do more evaluation. How do you communicate the importance of doing evaluation?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's another sort of communication message you have to get across. I mean, what I've seen in other organizations and situations, the use of showing them, how evaluation can be a useful tool to improve programs. So examples and case studies, success stories of how evaluation can be useful for better program management, etc., can often work. I've seen. Yeah, this is one way of doing it.
And getting back to the question we had on communicating negative findings, how would you best facilitate follow-up on negative findings? Because negative findings do not always result in action. And how would you be able, within your organization, but maybe also externally, to get people more to take action to do something about the negative elements that you're communicating?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, when you have, for example, let's look at a situation where the negative finding has shown that, a program or project is really, for example, not making any impacts and maybe is even having a detrimental effect. In that cases, and I've been involved in cases like that, I think the organization, has to be convinced that the evaluation is sound and robust enough. So that's one thing in terms of communicating the methodology and the data collected. And then I think it's more an interactive process where, it really has to be followed up within the organization and the management has to be involved. The management has to have the buy-in because, yes, as I said before, negative findings perhaps communicated less, but they're still very important to communication. They're difficult to digest, but that can have quite a significant impact in the organization. Say, well, look, we're going to stop doing that. So someone has to take the decision. So, follow-up, investment of management, reaching the management, these are all important aspects. Of course, what often happens is where the evaluation often will be challenged because of producing negative findings. So the evaluation has to be sure in its methodology and the data produced, because that would be the immediate reaction, is to challenge the methodology and the findings, which you also see quite often.
Yeah.
Rightly so or not.
Yeah. One other point would be that even if we have our communication findings, quite often organizations don't share them as openly as we would like to see happening. How could we improve the sharing between organizations? It's one thing to learn from it internally, but it's a whole other thing to share it more widely.
Yeah, here really us as a public or whatever, we can't do much about that. It's up to the organizations to take the decision to share. But the person who raised this question is right. Organizations are not always so transparent. And, often a difficult evaluation report or a critical evaluation report, even if they have a transparency policy, they may not choose to share it. Often I think it comes up to pressure from stakeholders. Like, I've been involved in evaluations where, we interviewed hundreds of stakeholders and they said, well, can we see the report? Where is the report?
Yeah.
The organization doesn't want to share it, and they put pressure. The evaluation team has a limited ability, I think. The external evaluators has limited ability. So pressure has to come from within the organization, from the donors, and from those who were involved in the evaluation. Put pressure on the organizations, because I think often the organizations are oversensitive in what they want to reveal. I think organizations at the minimum should be publishing an executive summary at least on each evaluation that they undertake. That only can help us all learn more, and I'm quite surprised as to how little is published.
Yeah, and I think it also will become harder and harder to find beneficiaries who want to collaborate in areas that are prone to multiple evaluations over time.
Exactly.
Because if they don't see any results from sitting with all these people, then they won't be collaborating anymore.
Exactly. I was recently talking to a group of beneficiaries, and they said sometimes we feel like we're like patients. We're constantly consulted by doctors, but no one's coming us to show us a remedy or a solution.
Yeah.
So I thought that was, an interesting point, and you really understand that. I was recently in northern Senegal on the border between Senegal and Mauritania, and people there. We produced a video report, and refugees in that city, they have access to internet. They're looking at it. They can view. They're participating in online forums. I mean, I was quite surprised, but they do have access to internet and different ways of communicating. They don't have the bandwidth, but they're still interested to learn and see how their feedback is taken up at the higher levels, if you like, hierarchical levels, I would say.
I have a last question here, and if there are any other questions, type them in right now, because I have one outstanding question at the moment, but I'm happy to take one or two more. But this question is, have you worked before in a multi-funded situation, Glenn?
Multi-funded, what do you think that
Like an evaluation project with multiple donors?
Yeah, a little bit. Maybe there's two donors funding the evaluation. Yes.
If you are working in a project where several donors fund it, how do you best juggle among several M&E systems and several ways of which results need to be presented to all these different donors? And that's a question from Agus Nugroho.
I think that's a good point. It's very difficult because often it can mean a simple thing like you have to produce two different reports, which is already a pain, to put it bluntly. It can be, so it means that you have to sort of craft the messages to meet the different donors' needs. So it's not easy, I think. I think all we can do is to try and find common messages that both donors are interested in, and if necessary, craft messages in terms of the presentations we produce, etc., to meet the different donors' needs, as often they can be very specific in what they want. So yes, it does add a level of complexity, I would say.
Yeah, and what you do see in bigger post-disaster settings is that you get more and more a consolidated appeal process in which a group of donors work together with a group of implementers, and that limits then also the need to all do your separate reports for all these separate donors.
Exactly, like you see, as I mentioned, sort of real-time evaluations where, all the agencies and NGOs in a crisis situation will gather together so you don't have hundreds of people going out. I think that's a positive development, and I think we'll see, with the different structures, cluster systems in certain situations set up, we'll see more and more of that.
A last question of Oberti Mando, and that is, in a situation when an organization is limited to only using a standard evaluation report, like on paper, it cannot afford all these interactive forms and online systems. How to best maximize the impact of just a simple report?
Yes, firstly, I think the first thing is the format of the report. You might be like, in certain bodies, you're restricted by the actual structure of the report. So you might not be able to change the structure, like, you must have a 20-page body, you must have an executive summary. If you're restricted in that way, then you have to really think of how you craft the words and the phrases, how you can use visuals. So the very format. Denise put up some documents, links that have, how to write a good evaluation report. And if you look on my blog, Intelligent Measurement, just search for it on Google, I have some sort of blog posts about how to better write reports. So one is the actual report writing and its presentation. and how you can, basically work with that. Secondly is the dissemination of the evaluation report. You can do a lot today. Presuming your report is going to be published, is openly available. So you can do a lot to publicize and disseminate your report through social media. So it basically reaches beyond the usual suspects. Like if you've got a Twitter account and you put up a simple, evaluation report now available, and it doesn't take much to sort of like pull out the 5 key messages of your report and summarize that in a blog post, a press release, to put on a LinkedIn group and then link back to your report. So you can get a better take-up of your report by having a very simple promotional strategy which doesn't cost anything. It costs a couple of hours of your time, and you just need a basic ability to use social media. Because if you put it on Twitter and then maybe someone else retweets it, you've already doubled the amount of people that are potentially exposed to your report. So I think that's 2 things you can do is 1, play with the format and the way you present it, and secondly, have a simple promotional strategy, presuming your report is going to be public.
Yes, because not all these tools online are for pay service. I mean, if you do webinars, then you have to pay for the service. But
it's relatively cheap.
Yes, and you can make PDF files and you can upload them for free these days, and you can have a Facebook and a LinkedIn account and a Twitter account, and that's all for free. So you can reach out without having a lot of resources if you have the time for it, because that's another point. It does take a little bit of time to navigate the digital world in that sense.
Exactly, and you need a bit of time then to interact with the public. So someone might write back to you, someone might say, "Oh, can you send this or that," etc. So yeah, I think there are for that question, there are opportunities and what you can do. That's presuming you have time. I don't think it's a question of budget, as you said. There are different things you can do to maximize.
And that was also our last question. And Glenn, do send me the link to the blog on report writing. Then I'll make sure it will also be put online on our website, so it will be accessible. We will send out an email to all participants the moment that the recording has been put online and all the resources are there. And you can then freely access all of it, and also this webinar will be there as a presentation in PDF and also as the recording on YouTube, which is free. So that's good as well. Glenn, let me thank you very much for your time today. And I have the feeling, Glenn, are you there?
Happy, sorry.
Okay.
I'm here now, yes. Sorry, I'm really happy to have been able to have this discussion, and it's been very interesting, your questions, etc. And really happy to follow up on any points as people need. And
I have the feeling that was also appreciated by our attendees. We had at some point 40-45 attendees who and we had a good Q&A session here in the end. I think there were some very intelligent, some very interesting questions posed here. At times some questions are not that easy to answer, and some questions will need a mentality shift from the organization. Some will perhaps need a slight mentality shift as well from the side of donors to collaborate a little bit more with one another, and to not overburden organizations with the number of reports that they need to write. But that is food for yet another webinar, I think.
I think so also, certainly.
So having said that, I am going to thank you once more, Glenn, for your time this morning, and I wish everyone a good day for the people who still have a full day, and I wish everyone a good evening in Asia and the Americas. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.